With us today, we have Dr. Larissa Doroshenko, a emerging scholar of political communications. Most recently, Dr. Doroshenko published a study during which she investigated the manipulation of information by Russia leading up to what is now a military invasion of Ukraine. Today, we're talking to Dr. Doroshenko about this incredibly relevant analysis in light of the current state of military conflict in Ukraine. Dr. Doroshenko, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Could you give a little background on the Russian Internet Research Agency and how they played into this kind of information warfare?
So the Internet Research Agency, there are like different conversations. So it's exactly its birth dates, most scholars confer that it started its activity in around 2010. And one of the first tests, or one of the possibly first tests that we've seen in the research, was its use on 2011 after presidential elections, when there were a lot of protests in Russia, in Bolotnaya Square, in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, again, these protest cities, but also all over the country at that time. And Russian trolls were used to flood and suppress the narrative around the protests, around the fraudulent elections, distract with other types of information and pushing other agendas online to distract people from the protests happening and flooded with other types of information. We know for sure now that the bots were used in 2013 Operation Donbass, so that's what the paper was focused on. But there are also a lot of evidence that this Internet Research Agency was also active during a military operation in Syria. So as we worked through this data set that we had in the archival data, a lot of them were using Arab rating. A lot of them had hashtag Syria. We did not have any experts, unfortunately, at the time who were able to read those tweets. But there's definitely, knowing that Russia also had backed up Assad's regime, and Russia has a lot of military presence and interest in Syria, it was not surprising that it was also engaged in this disinformation campaigns in that area as well. And we've obviously seen it in 2016 in the US. And also, I think, during Brexit as well, there are investigations about it, and also other interference in other election campaigns afterwards all over the world.
You mentioned that initial IRA efforts were directed at the domestic audience for a couple of years, and then it gradually started being used internationally. That's, I think, exactly what we observed. They started right with the Russian protests in aftermath of 2011, when it was getting clear that Russians were getting more and more dissatisfied with their government, right? And this chess games that Putin was playing with the changing constitution, so creating some type of proxy for a couple of years because he could not be elected for too long. And then afterwards, they were used at that time. Then they were tested in Ukraine, and then they also started exporting those pre-tested and strategies that they saw worked, right? Like, for example, if I post this type of tweet, it gets a lot of retweets, and we looked at also the features that they were using, so looking at the links, but also looking at the type of hashtags they use, the type of ad mentions they use to get traction, to get more retweets, and also to get more followers at the end as the result of it. And so the most successful strategies essentially were employed later on, at least in the United States, like what we studied for sure, but I did not see how they were not explored later on as well.
Regarding IRA activity on social media back in 2014, you have said that your analysis revealed that they didn't just spread falsehoods, they engaged in reflexive control. Can you elaborate on what reflexive control is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important. I will start a little bit kind of with a preview. So I think it's very important for us to realize that disinformation campaign is not just fake news, right? As you already said. And I think that what made a lot of people kind of being complacent. And now I also see that a lot of conversation how Russian propaganda doesn't work anymore, just because we see a lot of kind of retaliation cases in the West and on the Western media. and I think that's also like can put us in a more like complacent state of mind where we're like, oh, like it's not as scary as we thought it is. But if and also makes us kind of catch specific instances of these falsehoods and not like kind of looking at the trees, but not at the forest behind it, or like not at the bigger patterns. And this theoretical framework of reflexive control really enables us to look at the patterns in disinformation rather than specific instances. And then it enables us as scholars or as citizens to see whether certain pieces of information we see on social media or in the news, whether they feed those goals and whether they feed those patterns, rather than just try to chase those instances one by one. And the reflexive control as a framework was developed back in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And actually, I've seen also some works where experts are saying that it stings specifically for Putin because it was believed that effective use of this reflexive control essentially helped US and helped the West to dismantle the Soviet Union eventually. So they were much stronger with that informational propaganda, and that's one of the reasons why they won and led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So it's really interesting that for Putin it could be like almost, when you can talk about the psychological condition of that person, but for him it could be like a personal revenge almost, to establish a very strong reflexive control operation to kind of take revenge for the defeat of the USSR. And that strategy essentially feeds like an adversary, like an enemy, information, erroneous information that leads that adversary to make a wrong decision. So you're not saying them what to do. You are not going to directly say the false things. You are feeding information in such a way that make them more likely to make a wrong decision. And in this case, there's this kind of famous 4D strategy to kind of simplify it. So it's distort, dismiss, which I think we've seen a lot. So kind of distorting like really facts like fake news, or dismissing, just denying your involvement or not discussing it. Like as we can say Russia right now, also like distorting some facts about saying that we have a Nazi or fascist government in Ukraine, or dismissing the facts about high casualties and that they're targeting civilians as well, or like they're losing a lot of manpower and a lot of equipment in Ukraine these days. But another strategy that I argue is especially targeted to foreign audience and is much more subtle is distracting and dismaying. So distracting being introduced in certain issues with certain takes on the information that would distract from the main kind of purpose, or that would also create or exacerbate divisions between among people or between countries. And dismaying is obviously just playing more with the emotions and fear mongering, and just saying more how, I think especially with this crisis, we see a lot of nuclear threats and just kind of like playing with that. Like even yesterday, we witnessed how Russian forces were like shelling the nuclear power in Zaporizhia. So, I mean, again, I think it's just part of that very deliberate part playing in this dismaying. So yeah, so it's much more complex than just creating false information. We should be more careful and look for these patterns in the information we see these days.
In your most recent study, you mentioned that the IRA is often referred to as Cold War 2.0 in its use of strategies such as reflexive control. Are there any other propaganda techniques you've noticed Russian involvement in the media using that also reflect the Cold War?
I think in general, we see a certain conversation like trying to distract from the issue. I've heard recently a lot during the State of the Union or during the time we've seen like build the war, or just in general, so because of this narrative how Biden should care more about our southern border than he cares about the border between Russia and Ukraine. So that narrative might be organically created by parties, or like, as they also call it in propaganda research, useful idiots, but they can be artificially, and they are artificially amplified by Russian propaganda. So some of my friends in Ukraine sent me like a list of Telegram channels, and Telegram is a Russian-based messaging app that is getting more popularity also, especially among far-right groups in the United States, partially because it helps them to invade more I guess, hate speech and other type of flags that they might got on more traditional social media platforms such as Twitter or Facebook, because they're more alert and more aware of it. So it's becoming more popular, and it's very popular in Russia. So now, in addition to Twitter, we also see a lot of these Telegram channels created to promote kind of certain Russian propaganda, essentially. And I've seen, for example, certain memes saying, like with the Biden's face and some oil refinery, oil drilling equipment in the back, kind of on the horizon, saying "Make Russia rich again." So a lot of this is circulating on in Russian propaganda websites, and we might see them as kind of separate instances, but essentially they are similar parts of distracting from the main issue. And another thing that also, like another distracting strategy that I've noticed recently, to my dismay or to my disappointment, was also a lot of support, like kind of a lot of conversation among people supporting Black Lives Matter movement. And like on the far right, like if you're talking about, on the far left, we talked about like what right GOP is doing. On the left side, we see also a lot of conversation how Ukrainians are racist, we shouldn't be supporting Ukrainians. A lot of them are siding also with the Russian propaganda narrative, talking about that there's a fascist government in Ukraine, talking about that the war's been going on for 8 years. Where have you been all these 8 years? And those are all the strategies used by Russian propaganda. They're just being translated into English and spread among Americans right now. And I've also on this Telegram channels used for Russian propaganda, I saw there was even like some tweets translated from English to Russian, and one of them was from BLM supporters saying, "Let not Putin distract you from important issues. Ukrainians' lives don't matter until Black lives matter." And it's like a very it's a false analogy or like false choice, logical fallacy, right? You don't just decide between the two. It's an important crisis. We can talk obviously about any type of instances where students of color are not treated equally at the Ukrainian border right now who are trying to evacuate. That's obviously a separate conversation, but there were also a lot of some fake information also circulated around it. Not everything was verified. Some of the instances I know it's true because I got in touch with some friends in Ukraine who were able to confirm it. A lot of it was not true. So again, this narrative might have emerged organically because of those instances where, let's say, Ukrainians just prioritize only women and children, and those students of color were left, for example, for later just because they were males. But that was interpreted as a racial issue and get amplified, and was also helped by Russians, trolls or Russian propaganda, to amplify even more and say, "Oh, hey, look, we only care about white people here." And that's very, very upsetting. And what it does essentially, that creates and exacerbates divisions among American society around the issue of Ukraine. Like, should we support it or should we not support it? Oh, they're racist, that's why we shouldn't be supporting it. Or we're not gonna, be as engaged in our kind of protection of this young democracy. So that's, again, like that's some of the examples, but I argue they just fall very neatly into this distracting strategy of the reflexive control.
Can you provide us some insights on the increasing sophistication of these IRA campaigns and possibly highlight some ways to detect these disinformation strategies in future campaigns?
Mm-hmm. I think one part is to, first of all, being aware of this. So we finally saw the ban of Russia Today from Facebook. We saw how the ads are not, the company would not be able to purchase any ad. I think either on Google as well, Facebook for sure. So there are also a lot of other similar propaganda websites that are known to US government. So there's been this report from the Global Engagement Center at the US Department of State back in 2020, where they listed a lot of websites associated, like with Russia Today, associated with Russian propaganda. If we started blocking Russia Today, I think we just, if you say A, you should say B. We should block them all. Similarly, it's one way to block their presence, official presence on social media. I, as a user, can still go to the website and can still post the link from it on my account. So for blocking, and then again, if we have certain like created accounts from Russian trolls or maybe even regular Russians who want to present alternative information to their friends abroad, they can still do that. I can still go and post those links to Russia Today on my social media platforms, and people will share them, and it still spreads. Maybe not as fast, but if you employ trolls, for example, it will spread faster. So monitor those links as well, not just closing the profiles, but also monitor if this link's being posted, who are they being posted by, getting information from these users, trying to figure out who they're connected to. Maybe we can detect a troll network this way. And another part is obviously, like it may be like, again, a bit more controversial, but we know that Russian propaganda has been using those not automated with the bots, but also semi-automated with the trolls, means to promote its agenda. If we are trying to win this battle, information battle, why don't we use the same type of strategies? But instead of obviously promoting propaganda, why don't we promote truthful sources of information? BBC, Deutsche Welle, Radio Free Liberty, they're all banned in Russia right now because Russia realizes that they are presenting verified information about what's going on in Ukraine. Those sources are trusted. I'm not even talking about maybe more controversial as like CNN, and we can, start like these partisan battles again within the country. Let's go with the, I don't know, European sources, but amplify those voices on social media. Because right now we're just playing a fair battle. We are relying on their accounts and the user engagement. Russia is relying on a bunch of bots and trolls to promote their propaganda. So if we're trying to win this battle, I would argue we should use similar measures to amplify truthful sources of information. And another last thing is, instead of maybe looking at the specific instances of the fake news, see patterns. Like if I see certain type of information, let's say about all of this, not all refugees are created equal. Ukraine is discriminating against refugees. My first thing is okay, that's really sad. Let's verify this information if it's true. And my second thought is, who is benefiting from this information right now? And obvious answer is Putin, because he tried to create this artificial refugee crisis just a couple of months ago on the border between the European Union, Belarus, and Belarus, by bringing in tons of refugees from Syria and Iraq and trying to make them to cross the border. And Belarusian border controls didn't help them and aid them in this and not stop them. So it was completely artificially amplified, artificially created to divide Europeans more. Exactly at the time when Biden administration received information about the Russian plan to invade Ukraine and was trying to rally and unite the European partners. So at the same time, all of the strategies, creating this kind of type of refugee conversation and saying that European countries are hypocrites, or trying to see whether you can create certain tensions within the European countries in terms of how they treat refugees. All of that is helping Putin. And so, in other words, okay, those issues are important to address, but let us not get distracted by them. And I think if we keep this goal in mind, if we think, okay, what is the pattern might be about? what is that specific instance fall into? Who is this information benefiting? We will be also much better equipped into detecting those disinformation campaigns that are more subtle than just the fake news.
Okay, it looks like we're out of time for today. We've been talking to Dr. Larissa Doroshenko, emerging scholar of political communications, about her research on Russian disinformation campaigns. Dr. Doroshenko, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.